This video was produced by
glorious
cruelest
day.
month. Definitely the cruelest month. So thanks for coming out, and thank you very much to Melissa, Team Alemin, Melissa and Carlos, for agreeing to give a talk. They are both from the School of Communication Studies, and Melissa is also now Associate Dean in the Graduate School. And since we're and since I don't usually do big introductions, we're very happy to have them here. Melissa's also been kind enough to serve on the board of IBS and to teach here, so that's very nice as well. I think I will now shut up and turn it over to them to talk about family photos and storytelling in multicultural families.
Thank you, David. Thanks you for coming. I was very, very nervous up until about 5 minutes ago. And we presented this work, in fact, last November. We did it with Melissa's mom. And that was a fantastic presentation. And we've done it in front of pretty much colleagues at the national level in our discipline. And there's something about that anonymity that makes it safe, because what we reveal is actually very personal. And I was really nervous that you were going to have friends in the audience, you know, and that makes it even all the more nerve-wracking. But after seeing your faces, after you all started to come in, I started to calm down. So I want to thank you for being here and making this easy for us. This is a, I don't know if you can see it, this is a photo on our wall. One of my favorite ones, one of our family favorite ones. And we know it's our family favorite ones because when we talk about the photos in our house, there's convergence on this particular photo. We talk about it in different ways. This is how my son characterizes it when we asked him the other day about it. He says, I like the one with the girl by the tent. Okay, and I say, what's going on there? What's the story with the girl by the tent? Because I don't know, I kind of like it. I kind of really like the picture. I like the tent. I like the table that she has back there. I think that milk carton, the milk thing is really kind of cool, and there's a basket and it's kind of a floor. And I just like it. I just think it'd be cool to live in that tent. Okay, so, you know, what's the story here? Well, you know, the story is this is my godmother, my Nina Francis. And this is a picture taken of her at a migrant camp. And it was difficult for me to explain to him that this is not a cool place to live, right? That in other words, the image of my Nina standing in front of the tent that housed our family, my family, her brothers and sisters, is not a particularly thing that's cool. And it was difficult as he's telling me this for me to kind of stop and say, there's more going on here than just a cool picture. I'm drawn to this picture for a number of different reasons. The hope, the look on her face, the hope on her face, and just the stunning, she's just beautiful. Now my godmother passed away when I was about 4. So I didn't really know her in this way ever. And this is the only picture, the only first picture that I ever saw her as a child. And so I was drawn to it immediately. I actually don't know, okay? I actually don't know. And part of that mystery of it is what makes this picture so important, right? The image conjures up an imaginary, right? An imaginary idea of what it's like to live in a migrant. Now, I certainly worked with my family in doing field work growing up, but we never lived in a migrant camp. So there's a connection and a disconnect, right? I have a sensibility to field work, being out in the hot sun, but we went home to a house that we all have, you know, we all owned, and you know, it kept clean and showers and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. I went home being Selma, my parents' house, and I was talking about what we were doing, and I was talking about this picture in particular, and I was talking about my fascination with it here, right? And my mom said, kind of giggled, oh, you mean this is the picture of my Tia Francis? And I said, yeah, I love that picture. Okay, so, and she kind of giggled, and I said, why? And she goes, Francis, she goes, you know, the newspaper came out that week, and they were doing a story on families in migrant camps. And they told everybody that they were going to come out, and they wanted to take pictures. And she got all excited, right? And she went in, and she planned, and she dressed, she set out her dress, and she sent it for the next day, right? And she showed up looking pretty, and they staged the photo, right? And I'm hearing this story, and Melissa's hearing this story for the first time right here, right now. Okay. And I'm like, wow. Now what? Right?
This has been on our wall, like our household wall for...
Yeah, now what? Now what do we do with this, right? Now, the telling of that, the facts behind the story, don't delegitimize the image. They don't make it less. They don't make it any less special. But what they do is they introduce yet another narrative of how it came to be. And more importantly, it introduces a kind of question of, well, what are we supposed to do with this now? What do we do with the story that I tell, the story of how it came to be, and the story of my son saying this is really cool because this will go to him, hopefully. Yeah. And I think this is part of what we do as communication folks. We're not, I like to say this, we're not experts in photography or visual studies in any shape or way, but we do study, talk about families, talk about stories, and what that does for us and how that defines families. Which is what we're going to be talking about today, right? What does storytelling tell us about family? Oh, wow, I am going to go fast here. Okay, so I should go a little bit more into this. I'm going to kind of stick with this a bit. Certainly, as parents of Mexican American and European traditions, and as researchers of cultural and interpersonal communication, we've always identified with the importance of family stories. We were raised in very distinct and different ethnic, racial, religious, socioeconomic backgrounds, and we sometimes turn to these stories, personal stories, to help communicate our expectations to people who are both within and outside of our family, to construct our shared visions of family, and to tease out what it means to belong to a family. But as in our academic writing, we have been very concerned about the non-reflective idealism and power generically issued to family stories. We see this in a number of disciplines, that family stories are supposedly the glue that holds everything together. And we're like, well, sometimes that glue. Rather, what we do is reflect on storytelling practices, and we reflect on storytelling rituals as the important sites for presenting values, performing identity, and negotiating family culture. In order to make sense of these rituals of storytelling, we employ methodological processes similar to what Carolyn Ellis calls co-constructed narrative. This is something that Melissa is going to talk about in about 10 minutes, so I'll let her go into it. And mostly what we do is we draw upon routine stories told around our dinner table, stories told en route to vacation, similar repeated sorts of topics that we talk about. And then we look at how we talk about them. These narratives for us illuminate what we call the dialogic manner with which family stories and multicultural families in particular construct stories. So that was an interesting quote by Marvin, who says the act of storytelling is more than a gesture of affection and closeness, more than a means of educating children and conveying feeling. The telling of stories, the act of using breath and language to narrate an experience, is the confirmation and perhaps even the forging of family connection. In the telling and the listening, the storyteller's essence mingles with that of the listener, and thus strengthens the bond between the teller and the listener on a sacred level. And I think what we'd like you to do today is to consider how storytelling about photos, and the methodological practices of autoethnography are useful as the pictures and the stories themselves. Now certainly stories and storytelling are an important part of family communication. These are two images of my family. And I say my family, right? But this is my mother's brothers and sisters, in which I don't make this decision of like what level. This is my family. The scholarship on narrative widely asserts that family stories and personal stories function to socialize members about rules of behavior, divine shared sort of ideals. Typically, family stories are characterized as vessels for transporting and conveying information to how we are and who we aren't. And that's the common way. What we like to do, though, is rather than look at the story as a vessel, right, as a transport, we like to look at the storytelling, the transportation of that as a particular medium, as a particular means of conveying what it means to be a family. The photographs in our house, just like other topics that routinely come up, we have a book chapter on trouble. It's a routine topic that comes up. Are you in trouble? What does it mean to be in trouble? What does it mean to get in trouble? Another routine topical that's happening in our house right now is Catholicism. It's an important point in our son's life when he's having to do it. And it's always been an important topoi, point of invention for telling stories about who we are as a family. What does it mean to be Catholic? How are we Catholic? How are we not Catholic? How is something that's going on in the Catholic Church really making us mad? It becomes an important point. Well, photos do the same thing. This particular photo doesn't seem to draw much attention in terms of telling stories. It hangs on our wall, we take a look at it, but it's not a point of it. I think only a few people who have come over have asked, is this your family or who is this? This is a very recent photo that I'm waiting to put up on the wall. I'm waiting, right? Waiting for a particular reason. It shows the same brother-in-laws on top, okay? This is how I remember our family, right? This is inside my grandfather's house, and that's my grandfather way over here. And this is my father. And I love how all of them are wearing white. And there's my dad, right? And he has these really, really, really dirty khaki pants, right? And I asked, what's the story there? What is going on there? And in the conversation with my mom and my dad about this picture, they told me about the khaki pants. And that was an era that my dad would wear through khakis, working pants. It's a great story. And this one will draw more questions. Okay. So stories and photographs certainly transmit messages about families. But storytelling about those conveys an essence of family identity, or what we might call a manners of being. Right, manners of being. And certainly among Hispanic household, this idea of being well-mannered is a significant one. And we're not necessarily talking about well-mannered that you put your fork and spoon on the right sense. We're talking about, are you being in a way that is reflective of the essence of our family? That's more significant. Okay. Family messages, whether in both image and how we talk about them are coded. We know this. The image and the imaginary gives alternate meaning to the phrase, what does it mean to keep up family appearances? There are messages of identity such as race, class, and gender that are invoked and evoked in both our verbal and visual accounts of family that indicate our discomfort with our imagined selves in relation. This is another photo that we all converged on in our conversation about family photos. And I had to admit, I've never liked this photo, okay? There was something that always bugged me about it. And it exudes whiteness for me. And when I talked about this, I've always looked at this photo as a bunch of white people at a public pool. And here's my father-in-law, and there's my grandfather, and what are they doing there, right? And there was something about this photo, especially when it's juxtaposed to the images of the photos of being inside. Most of the families of my family are of inside that I found uncomfortable with, right? Like somehow the photos of my family were all inside, but somehow the families of Melissa's family were all outside, and there must be something going on here, right? Melissa reminded me that this is actually a family reunion. She also reminded me that the pool is at your Uncle Frank's house. And she thirdly reminded me that I've been to that house. And I recognized that pool in other photos. And I kept looking at that thinking, what is going on? What is it about this photo that is creating a discomfort with me with imagining that this is my family too? When Valerio talks about this, without skipping a beat, he says, oh, you mean that picture of my family? Okay. Which raises the question, he's not uncomfortable or finds discomfort, or maybe he does in that coded image, but I certainly do. So communication and storytelling in multicultural feminism can facilitate a telling where values are contested, ideals are negotiated, and family is constructed. They can be employed as a medium through which families and both family and family storytelling pass and emerge. Literally, you know, when you look at their images of our house, you have to pass through them to get to the rest of the house. And sometimes you notice pictures and you talk about it, and sometimes you don't. But by talking through the stories, telling the stories about the pictures, we emerge as a sense, having a sense of family, Langelier and Peterson write that the doing a family story highlights embodied communication, emotional and dynamic creative acts of making meaning and telling stories. As communication practices, telling family stories is a multi-generational creation and struggle over meanings. What events and actions are told and passed on, which family values are narrated, who tells the story and who listens, and what identities are visible and which are muted. In storytelling, families produce themselves as a family within, between, and over generations, and reproduce the family as a discursive construct. This is a picture that was taken the last time I visited home when I learned about my aunt in the staged photo. And we learned about it because my cousin Gloria was visiting. And she brought to my mom and dad an old family album. Okay. What was fascinating about this was that many of the photos that she brought were pictures of my mom's family that my mom had never seen before. And what was captivating about this moment was Gloria telling my mom what was going on in the situation. And my mom learning for the first time of these stories. Equally compelling was my dad supporting the narration of Gloria, right? And it was like, oh yeah, that's how it was. And it was a revelation for all of us, you know, wow. And there I was snapping away. So Melissa will talk now about collaborative autoethnography.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the processes that Carlos and I have been pursuing methodologically. And in many ways, this presentation today is more a methodological piece about how to use photographs as a topic for interviewing and talking within the family. And the methodology that we are working from is called autoethnography. And if that's a new term to you, autoethnography is essentially a process of writing that involves using one's personal lens or looking at culture through turning your eyes back on yourself. Right, so ethnography, it literally sort of translates to writing about culture. Using autoethnographic methods means that we're looking at one's positionality within a culture to inform some insight or understanding about culture. So it's really not just about our stories of families or our use of photographs, but how can that inform a topic like multicultural families and multicultural storytelling. So we're really using photography and photographic images to advance our conversations, to advance our autoethnographic processes. And if we look at some of the characteristics of autoethnography, or what we champion is collaborative autoethnography. Here we are studying multicultural storytelling in the family. If I write my story of our family and my experience of our photographs, basically my individual subjectivity is privileged. There's Carlos. If we're highlighting, if Carlos is telling his story, his experiences of our photos, then his subjectivity is privileged, and we don't really get a sense of how it's contested. And so what collaborative autoethnography does is allow methodologies for us to basically examine the intersubjective experiences and often conflict in our experiences of our family identity. And we believe that this will provide resonance for other people experiencing, having experiences in multicultural family life, which we hope. And this idea of the methodology is inviting dialogic encounters is tied to how we approach the storytelling itself. And so one of the methods that we have used is what Carolyn Ellis calls an interactive interview. And what we do is we stick a tape recorder on the table and have a dialogue around, in this particular project, around family photos. In other projects, it's been around the topic of caregiving or the topic of trouble, right? And then what's revealed in those dialogic encounters are contested identities around topics such as class, topics such as Catholicism, topics such as trouble or privilege, okay? At the same time, that allows us to question our lived experiences, right? So how are we engaging, how is our presumed experience in relationship to the artifacts and photos in our house questioned when we have a conversation about them? How is that raised? How is that also questioned in our storytelling about those artifacts? And we argue that the collaborative nature of this methodology really enables us to recognize that, particularly in many multicultural homes, that a contradictory experience with cultural identities is part and parcel of a multicultural family, and it's not particularly troubling. It's just the nature of multicultural family lives, that we live in a contested house, we live in a contested home, and that there's a comfort with that. And we see that in how we interact with family photographs. It's highlighted in that experiences. Collaborative autoethnography is also characterized by a kind of a reflexivity, a constant turning back on ourselves as objects and questioning our role in relationship to how we are experiencing storytelling, in this case storytelling about photographs. But it also allows us to have definitional ceremonies. That is, we're not just doing this for ourselves, although we think that many multicultural families do tell stories. Right, so Carlos's family is not sitting around the table thinking, I'm going to write a project about this, right? They're doing that activity, right? But as a methodology, this enables us to present these stories to others, whether it's in a public forum like this, whether it's in a published book chapter, article, and then we have a response to that, because all scholarship, of course, is conversational. People say, oh, no, I think you're wrong. And that opportunity helps us to understand and enrich our understanding of what that contestation looks like. So we're using this methodology of collaborative autoethnography through interactive interviewing, and what's also called, I think Carlos mentioned it, unmediated co-constructed narrative. That is, we will write and tell our stories or our experiences, and it might be in relationship to a conversation with a family or in a relationship to a photo in this case, and then share it with one another and look at what are the places in which it merges and what are the places in which there's contest. And we've seen that in our household a lot, for example, in our writing around caregiving as an important aspect. I'm going to move on because we're running close on time to talk about our methodology in relationship to a concept called narrative inheritance. And this is sort of, you might think, oh, this is kind of a no-duh concept, but we think it's a particularly kind of useful, sensitizing concept for thinking about the stories that we literally inherit from our family members and the ways in which they provide coherence for us or in which we respond in rebellion to them. What are the ways in which we resist those stories? Right, so we can think about what are the stories that are told through photographs. So these two photographs here, these are pretty significant photographs to me. They're my grandmother's. This is actually my maternal grandmother, and she was an apple blossom princess in Winchester, a little local historical. And this is my paternal grandmother, who, this is in front of an airplane, and I've actually used this in my writing before in terms of messages of gender. Very different messages of what it means to be a woman, but they also had stories about appearances, and that is part of, in class, really, the potential for a woman to be a pilot, right? And what does that mean? And this notion that I would be an astronaut, she tells me this all the time, I would be an astronaut if I was born when you were born, Melissa. This notion of the empowerment that comes with that, right? Which might be held into contest with other gendered ideologies that we talk about in our house. But this is important for examining how do I tell stories about these photographs to Carlos, and with Carlos, with Valerio, but also how do other family members resonate around this or respond to them in terms of this does not resonate with me. But also importantly, when we're talking about narrative inheritance, for your amusement, in many ways, we literally do inherit stories. So I inherited this photograph. My grandfather died a couple of weeks ago, and I inherited photo albums. And it was really interesting. My parents are divorced. And one of the things that Carlos and I have been talking about in relationship to this project is there are no photos of my intact family in our house. None. But my parents divorced when I was 28. So, so the idea of my intact family is really a significant part of my family inheritance. But what we see when we're talking about narrative inheritance in terms of also how we navigate cultural conversations about divorce are really important and significant. So the notion of what is not told, what stories are not passed down, or how are they passed down, and what are the ways in which we respond to that. And so this project became very salient to us when we were sitting looking at essentially what I inherited was my baby pictures, right? So I had this whole all these photo albums of my baby pictures and my parents' wedding albums, and Valeria was looking through them, and Carlos were all sitting looking through them and talking about how does this alter, right, our notion of family and our family stories, and how is this inheritance then playing an important part in recognizing what we do and we don't talk about as a family, what stories are told and what stories are hidden, what stories are omitted. And so, and part of that happens, even though Carlos has talked at the beginning of our talk on, showcased a lot of his family stories, and I'm showcasing here, this is my dad and this is my mom, by the way, showcasing images of my family stories. What's important is that is the conversation that comes together around those stories and how that evokes discussions and deliberations and contests about it, what it means to be family, right? So the concept of divorce is and sort of marital disintegration is an important narrative inheritance. How do we sort of tell stories around that? What does it mean to tell stories around that? How is that tied to our cultural identities around divorce, right? And how is that part of our narrative inheritance? But also the notion of telling stories as key to the continuity of family, which is kind of an age-old theoretical concept. We tell stories, as Carlos mentioned, as the glue to who we are as families. But typically, sociologically, that's talked about in terms of the codes, that a story is told and that the codes that are revealed in that story tell us how we identify, right? And we argue that in a multicultural family, when you have very different codes, for example, of what it means to get in trouble, or what it means to be married, or what it means to be a gendered person, or what it means to be a faithful, religious person, then it is the telling of the stories and it is the talking about the photos that is more significant than the static nature of these photos themselves. So that photos have been sitting in my grandparents' photo album for years, but it has new meaning because of how we talk about it. And we think that this kind of methodology, whether it's us collaborating in a multicultural autoethnographic project, or whether it's us going out and helping other people to craft co-constructed narratives, allows us to see the ways in which photographs do not offer static meanings, that they are fluid, and that they change with the context in which they are viewed, right? So that photo would have very different meaning to me 30 years ago than it has today in this context as we were putting together the slides for our presentation. We're at 25 minutes. Do you want to talk about the next? Much of what we've been talking about, I've been talking about in terms of the narrative inheritance is this notion of that which is omitted or that which is untold. This is another picture of Carlos's godmother, who was on the very first slide, coming back full circle. Most of the photographs on our walls in our house I put up. But I put up in collaboration with Carlos, like, I want to put these photos up. What do you think? And we have a conversation. And I wanted to put this photo up. This is this Thea Francis. Do you want to talk about what?
I gave it the veto.
He said no.
I said no. And we talked about this in terms.
Is it up or not?
It is
not
not
up.
up.
It's not up.
So this is stories untold.
Right. And actually, I like the way you use the word stored away, because it's not that it's untold, it's just put in the closet, right? Just like it's stored away. It's a stored away closet. And if it was hidden, we'd never find this. But we know where it is. We just kind of put it away for now until we're ready to bring it back out, right? So we put this one back out, and Melissa wanted to put this up, and I said, no, I don't want this one up. And I used the word showy. I said, it's very showy. And you were like, I don't even know what that word means, showy, but clearly you're giving me the thumbs down, and it's your Nina, I'm not gonna put it up, right? In hindsight, when talking again about not the photo, but in talking about the process, the choice to put it up and not put it up, and what I meant by showy, what I meant is this is an image in my scape view, deconstructs the imaginary as overly sexual. When I look at this picture, it's my aunt was not just hopeful, she was beautiful. She was beautiful. And the image to me, the way that she gazes, is almost sexual, and I can't take that. I don't want to see that, right? That's not going on the walls yet, right? Doesn't mean that I don't imagine or can revise my image of my Nina as being a sexual person. I just can't do it yet. And I think this is why we talk about this idea of families and families story told are not just who we are, or where we are, or who we have been, or how we are, but there's always that yet. There's always that story of who we are, who we yet to be, or who we might also be that we aren't quite sure yet, right? Maybe we're not quite sure how to talk about it, but there's always that yet part. So we leave you with some questions of discussions, and at least two of them are, we were anticipating there might be some students in here from cultural studies, and we might say, how do you hear this methodological approach to the description that Melissa talked about, autoethnography, as being complementary to cultural studies, but also what might be some other visual forms that might mediate storytelling in our family. And I put this last picture up, incidentally, because it's one that people sometimes comment on. This, I like this picture. Is this your family? And I was like, this is a very interesting picture because probably in all probability, much like the photo of the tent, this is a stage photo, right? Those hats are just a little bit too big and a little bit pristine, and it is of very distant relatives. This is, in all likelihood, a staged photo, but it speaks volumes in terms of a cultural and ethnic heritage that I want to hold on to.
We'll stop there.
We'll stop there. Lights? So.
David?
Wow. That was really really interesting, and prompted about 900 questions. So I'm just I'll start with one, which is, can you go back to the first image? Which is indeed a fantastic image. Yeah, okay. So this word story is really interesting. And it's particularly interesting, I think it gets, and I can't believe I'm going to say this word out loud, but I will, problematized when you're dealing with pictures. Because what one means by story becomes really interesting when there actually is fact there. Now, the picture is not socially constructed. The picture, and Kareem is not going to agree with this, but there is fact in that picture. And I thought one of the things that was fascinating about it, for me, of course, it was very interesting because as an art historian, I had an instant response to this when Carlos said, I don't know when it was. Because of course for the art historian, it's like, you don't know when it was? Well, you could find out when it was, and you could know instantly, and you could seek down the paper that it was in, and you could find out that in fact it was on June 23rd in the morning, and then you could find out what kind of pictures they were taking, and what kind of, and in fact, you could do all sorts of research that would elucidate all sorts of facts, and I understand that is not the point, and the point is about the dialogic nature of the image. But the notion of sort of the purity of social construction, in fact, these things are moving back and forth. What I found fascinating was that when your son looked at this picture, he did not go, oh God, evil camp. He picked up on the way she was feeling. She was really proud. It was fascinating hearing the description of what she was that particular day, because that's what you see. You don't see her going, I'm oppressed in a camp. You see her looking beautiful in this beautiful gown, and there may be a disjunction, which is painful, between the camp and the way she's looking. But in fact, there is all sorts of meaning that is not at all contingent, that was visible over years and decades. And it was visible to you too, and part of that disjunction was really painful. But for your son, who didn't have this disjunction, he looked at that picture and he went, wow, look, here is this self-possessed, poised individual who looks happy and proud. And he's right. And he's right because he read that in a certain way. Now, you may have read it in a certain way and then said, that's wrong and that's a disjunction, it doesn't make me happy. But there is meaning in that image that is communicable. And it's communicable at more than one time. It is communicable over time. And so in the same way, when you see the image of her later, and she's stunningly beautiful and she's looking off into the distance, you don't, there's no like socially constructed meaning of what she's gorgeous and she's attractive and she's looking off in the distance. Now, the reactions to that are different. You go, oh my God, look at this beautiful woman. She's so self-possessed and wonderful. I would love to show this. And you go, whoa, man, she's hot, and this hot thing is just really uncomfortable. But the fact is, with that too, there is meaning there. And so this is a very long way of saying that word story, the sort of admixture of fact, fiction, and document is different when you're dealing with an image.
And that's why we prefer the word storytelling. So there's a difference between the story, the content, which I would agree with you. There's fact here, there's a story here. But what we're examining as communication, as family communication
But the fact is, what was revealed in the kitchen, what you found so interesting, was fact.
Right, but
she said
No.
what she felt on that day, and there was a certain understanding
No,
of what she was like.
what was fascinating wasn't so much the fact. What was fascinating was the existence of that. In a similar way, what we did with this.
The reason you told that story, the reason you found it so revealing, was you had a particular understanding of this picture, and you found out something about it that completely revised your thinking of that picture. It was not simply that, well, actually, so-and-so had this particular view, and so-and-so
No,
had this particular
I don't think you're hearing it all. I don't think you're hearing it all. That's not the interesting part.
I'm not hearing.
No, the interesting part is what do we do with it now? That's the interesting part. It isn't that all of a sudden I learned it was published on this day or I know what year it is. That's not what's fascinating. What's drawing to me is that we have this, we got this story, we've got this new one. And the interesting thing is, what are we going to do with this now, right? And I think when you, for example, my son, you gave way too much credence to my son. It's like, really, my son was fascinated with the tent, right? The girl, whatever, it's called The Girl by the Tent, right? And if you look at the description of it, it could be the dog by the tent. It's not by the, it's the tent that is of his focus interest. His description of it is all that's going on in the tent. Yeah, it's all that's going on in the tent, which is, of course, getting to me like, it's not the tent, son. it's the girl, right? It's the girl, right? And because the tent is this, that, and the other, right? But it's the tent that he's drawn to, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what do I do with that now? Because I'm not going to correct him and say, son, you got it all wrong, and blah, 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 blah. It's like if I accept that contested reading, right? If I accept that contested reading, then I open myself up, right, as not having the only authoritative understanding of the meaning of that text. And so I guess I would say, you know, where you're drawn to the fact of the photo, I'm just speaking,
Okay.
we might be drawn to the photo making, right? There's the photo, but what do we make of it? What do we do with it now?
The interpretation.
Right. And the interpretation of ourselves in making that interpretation. And that's the communication part of it, right? So it's not simply the subjective, but what do we do with this, you know, in our text, it would be the verbal text of our interpretation of it. And what do we do with that text? Which is why we will listen to our tapes, or listen to our digital recordings of ourselves talking about it, and then we'll sit there and go, I can't believe I just said that right there, right?
But also how, if we think about the photo as a prompt for an interview or a scaffolding of a conversation, it then might lead to conversations about our childhood, conversations about the meaning of hard work and labor, contrasting, like, so he'll start telling stories about picking grapes, and my first job was fast food, you know, not till I was 16. You're picking grapes when you're, what, 6?
Yeah.
How does that then reveal meaning to our very privileged child, right? And how is that negotiated? So this is a photograph that hangs in our house that then enriches a whole set of conversations about the value of labor and work and cultural history.
Yeah. And he'll draw that up, right? You know, we'll talk about, son, you're not working, because he rolls his eyes and he goes, I know. You know, it's like you were picking grapes and you were a kid my age. It was really hot, blah, blah, blah. You know, so. You know.
I'm curious, you know, I think every relationship brings two sides to a story, you know, my family, your family, and often the partner can illuminate the other person in ways you don't anticipate about your own relationship and how you're positioned potentially in your family. And photos often are this record of an idealized version of family in many cases.
Yeah.
Have you guys had any discoveries in that way, illuminating each other about, well, you may feel that and think this, but actually I hated my so-and-so. Oh, you were so benevolent there. And I know that's been true with Lori here.
Yeah.
Opened our eyes to each other in ways we didn't expect.
You want to do that one?
I think we've found ourselves surprised by similar interpretations sometimes more often in terms of what we think a photo means and how that might represent our identities. That's a really good question. Certainly in our conversations where we were talking about the significance of photos, what was revealed is surprising in terms of why particular photos were so significant to us. And often that was more revealing of the other than maybe our assumptions about why we thought a photo was important, but just what was surprising. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think there's another thing there that while we're talking about the photos, we become very mindful that even our talk isn't ours, right? That we're borrowing from a language of aesthetic, that we're borrowing from a language of culture, that will, in and of itself, privilege a way of evaluating the photo or evaluating what is being characterized in that photo, right? And so it was really painful to like hear myself talk about the pool thing as white people. I mean, I had to say that, you know? And I have to say it to my wife. I just see them as a bunch of white people, you know?
But what it raised was a conversation about that era of family photos in my family and
Right.
why we don't have a lot of photos, because I also associate, even though I know everyone the reason that photo's up is because it's I know everyone in the photo. but is with the cultural imaginary of 1940s, 1950s whiteness and what those photos evoke. And so that was one of our more interesting conversations. And it's not that, oh, you know, I don't love my aunts and uncles, but this particular photo doesn't capture that. Instead, it evokes a sense of whiteness and white privilege, which of course that pool shot also does, that I was attending to. And I think that was a really revealing conversation.
And I think that's something that when we personally talk about it, when we talk about our personal meanings, we're not open to the fact that even our personal, you know, descriptions of our subjective identities are informed by larger cultural scripts about what things are supposed to be and how they're supposed to be. So, you know, getting that collaboration, having that check there, being careful not to play therapist, you know, is really important, because we just say this is text. This isn't necessarily me. This is how we're talking about it. It's text, and it allows us to step in, step out, step in, step out of the text.
AJ had a question.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, you're talking about using photographs as prompts for conversations that create these story arcs that go out and they come back to you because they're arcs that kind of create a circle around you. And I understand that project. I think looking at the presentation here, the one thing I might be missing is that the picture itself sort of disappears. That is, you're not bringing new words to the photograph. You're sending them out based on, and a lot of these photographs, you're very word oriented. It's very talk oriented. It's storytelling. So the verbal comes first, and I wonder if there isn't a way to come back to the image itself and read the picture as itself. You might be doing the kind of research David's talking about. What kind of paper? When was this done?
Right.
And it means that when you do the presentation, I want to see the pictures much bigger. I want them to occupy my consciousness, because that was the prompt. That mute thing was the prompt for all of these words and reflections and family history. Because there's some things about those pictures, the pool picture, I was fascinated with how rectangular everybody was. And I thought, well, maybe it's because of the pool. You know, you can make a lot out of the shape and form that comes out of that. And the second thing was the whiteness, and I was glad that you mentioned it. But that in and of itself is the photograph talking to you. There is a way in which these things talk. So just, I understand the balance that you have, I think, but that may speak a little bit to what David was talking about. If you think, let the image tell the story, too.
And can I just follow on what AJ's saying? Because my question was sort of about what if there is no photograph? Because if you're saying what really matters in your response to David was, it's not the photo, it's not the picture that matters, it's the stories and everything that floats and unfolds around that. That is, AJ called it a prompting image. So what happens in ethnography if you take the prompting image, the actual physicality of the photo not there, but you engage in storytelling as a family? Is your work still as alive and as driven as ethnographers without the photographs there? Because in a way I'm hearing you don't need the photographs.
Most of our work is not in the context of visual images. This is just a piece, right? So most, particularly our more recent writing about conversations about trouble and discipline, and then my more recent writings on notions of family care, caregiving, and narratives of dementia have all been around actual told stories, right? What are the repeated stories in our family? And you know, this is our use of photographs is pretty new for us. The notion of what is prompting those stories is that they're oft told. They're most often referenced, right? And one of the ways in which we're using photographs as integrated with storytelling practices is that they are oft often referenced photographs, or then in the case of narrative inheritance where they're hidden photographs, why are they salient? So they might be salient photographs that are hidden from view, but they are referenced as important.
We know they're there.
We know that they're there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so I mean, this is very helpful for me because I didn't know I was thinking that, but that is exactly. and this notion, I mean, part of it, I mean, that word attentiveness. When I look at that picture and I hear you describe the picture, and then I hear your son's description of the picture, you have wildly different interpretations. And you may say, oh yeah, he's 15-year-old, he's not really paying attention, he's thinking of the 10. No, he's not. And I'm not saying he's thinking of specific things. I'm saying when any human being looks at an image, they have a certain interpretation, not because, well, they just had this thing in their head, but because they're looking at a particular image. And so to use it as a prompt, and have people have wildly different interpretations, and not pay attention to the image to see not just, okay, what is this prompting, but what different kinds of interpretation. I mean, there's an incredibly rich, fertile ground there for, okay, follow up with them. So when you see this, when you see the 10, what about the 10? What do you think of this person? And all of a sudden there, you're going to get a whole lot more understanding of how he feels about femininity. What does he think about gender? What does he think? And so, I mean, my thought is sort of like Lori, either just forget the photos and have nice conversations about stories, but if you're going to use those stories, use them as the incredibly valuable resource they are. It's one thing to show them at a national conference because they're really great, and people can go, oh look, I can hang on to that because it's a good picture. But if you're going to complete the work that you've outlined, you owe it to those pictures to really deal with them and not say, well, actually, this is just a prompt. Because if it's just a prompt, do it without the picture. Because otherwise, you're going to have a whole lot of people going, wait, look at that picture. There's this, and there's this, and there's this. And if the answer is, oh, yeah, it's just a prompt.
I agree with you. I both agree with you and disagree with you. And one of the things that was interesting to us about having this forum as an opportunity to talk about something that was pretty embryonic was to get that kind of feedback.
That's why we're here, baby.
And the sort of pushback or the challenge for us is that we're really interested as people who study family life and family communication is how people are talking about that which they're surrounded with in their daily life in that lived experience. So yes, we are having these engaged conversations as scholars, reflecting on how do we talk about these photos in our daily life. So the reality of Valerio walking down our hallway and stopping at that photo and looking at it is not part of his experience. But what he does look at, which we didn't talk about today, are the 2 sets of photos by his bedroom wall. Right, and he knows them in intimate detail, and that was revealed in this project, which we didn't talk about. And so thinking about, well, how is how we arrange visual artifacts in our house really important to that lived experience of how that prompts storytelling.
And I'm sure that if we were in architectural studies, they would have said the same thing, right? You didn't look at the angle of the hallway, right, and how that situated the picture in front of him and structured his reality. I'm like, you're right. There's a lot of things going on here. The size of the light bulb that I'm using is prompting this. But in those ones, it's pictures it's because they're situated immediately in front of his door. That's what he's attending to. It's not necessarily the picture. It's the placement of him that he would describe. And I'm not saying that it isn't there. I'm just saying that in his characterization of what is going on here, what's the story here.
Well, then those would be really interesting pictures to talk about because you'd have him looking really carefully, you'd have you all looking really carefully, and you'd have a really, I think, a richer dialogue than using it as simply a prompt.
But any picture that it seems to me that there must be pictures in a family repertoire of pictures that bring out stories that, it's not that they're hidden, it's just that they're not part of the common dialogue. So I would argue that's not about the picture. It's the picture that is like, oh, right, we don't talk about this much, not because scary, put it in the closet kind of thing. It's just got lost in
The shuffle.
in the shuffle, right? And
In the
so
cardboard
you're not
box.
going to get some of that out, and it could be a picture you see every day for whatever reason doesn't elicit this recollection of some
Yeah.
deep, rich story that does expose some of the things that you're probably trying to expose, which I'm trying to grab onto.
That's a good
Science,
observation.
so,
No, yeah.
What struck me is you were careful to say it's not like psychotherapy or something, but I had someone in probably 15 or 20 years ago who was a psychiatrist, and he does look at family albums with people to unearth things. So when you said that those were your parents and they're divorced, it's like you can look at that, and he's looking away. It's like you can almost see in there, and that's what he did. He went back through
Yeah.
family photos and showed us
Yeah.
that, like, you can
Yeah.
almost decipher things about your family
Yeah.
history just by
Yeah.
looking at the dynamics among people.
Side story, so my mom's a social worker and therapist. And we actually wrote a paper on the connections between collaborative autoethnography and narrative therapy, that the processes are almost identical. Although that is not what we're trying to achieve here.
Right.
You're right. There
But it
is,
seemed like, wow,
there's
it's
something
like
really rich
It's
there.
a stone's throw away where you could
Yeah.
like veer
Yeah.
into that, and how does that multicultural
Right.
home that your son's being raised in, how does that change his
Yeah.
sense of reality?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of, usually our family photos are coming from the good days.
Right.
Yeah.
Good days in a family, who has their camera out?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where, again,
Yeah.
the memory, the
There's
power.
Uncle Bob
Sure.
with that drunken.
I think that's, I mean, yeah. The commonplace one is an interesting one because the photo thing is now just, hey, you just pull out the photo, snap away. You don't have to even store it. It's on your computer. I don't know. I got more gigabytes from photos that are useless, but I'm keeping them, right? And I think this idea of the commonplace one, the one that's there that we don't talk, that we certainly could talk about. Why don't we talk about this picture anymore? Is a significant one, or the Uncle Bob things. Those, you know.
We had an art history student the other day, the other year, who did a paper on Facebook photos and the use of Facebook photos and how.
Fascinating.
And it was exactly. Yeah.
There's a photo spread of our wedding, and we had JMU students play.
A string quartet.
Yeah, string quartet play at our wedding, right? And so there's like these 4 pictures, and Valerio brought this. Again, what are the ones that you look to? And he goes, it's just a strange one. There's 2 strange ones. There's a photo of me drinking coffee, and this is because it looks like I'm looking at him all the time where he goes. And he goes, but there's the one in your wedding, and there's like 3 random JMU students there. They're not even family. And I'm like, oh yeah, there are. How strange. And that was before we came to JMU. We got married before we got JMU, obviously. And it irritates him. Like
Who are these people on our
who are these people on our wall? I notice that all the time, and we're like, you know what? I actually don't. Why do we have that on our wall?
I know, maybe we need to replace that photo.
Probably shop them out.
Yeah.
Put something else there.
Yeah.
All right, folks, I think we're
Thank you.
over time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers.
Thanks for being friends.